Imagine a battlefield in Normandy. 1944. The ground shakes. The sky lights up with trails of fire. And a deafening roar, like endless thunder, makes German soldiers freeze in their trenches. This isn't conventional artillery. It's the M8 rocket launcher, America's secret weapon that transformed the war. Welcome to German troops. Couldn't believe America's rocket artillery in 1944. An audiobook that takes you to the heart of the Western Front, where Allied rockets surprised the Wehrmacht, shattering its morale and opening the way to victory. Prepare for a journey filled with fire, steel, and the power of human ingenuity that changed the course of World War II. In the days following D-Day, German soldiers, veterans of the Blitzkrieg and the battles of the Eastern Front, thought they knew the art of war. Their Panther tanks and Atlantic Wall fortifications seemed impregnable. But in July 1944, a new sound erupted on the battlefield. The howl of M8 rockets, fired from Sherman Calliope tanks and T-34 launchers. These weapons, capable of launching 60 rockets in seconds, unleashed a storm of explosions that pulverized bunkers and demoralized troops. German diaries describe the panic. It was as if the sky was falling on us. This book explores how this technology stunned the Wehrmacht, marking a turning point on the Western Front. The M8 rocket launcher wasn't just a weapon, it was a revolution, developed in secret by the US. Military. This system could saturate a 1,000-meter area with explosives in less than a minute, outperforming traditional artillery. While the Germans relied on their Nebelwerfers, Allied rockets offered unprecedented accuracy and mobility. In 1944, the US deployed hundreds of these launchers in Normandy, integrating them with tanks and infantry to breach German defenses. This audiobook takes you behind the scenes, from secret laboratories to battlefields, showing how a bold idea became a weapon that left the Germans stunned. The surprise was not only technical, but psychological. German soldiers, accustomed to the roar of cannon fire, were unprepared for the visceral impact of the rockets. The sound, described as a demonic train, and the chain explosions created a terror that shattered morale. In battles like Saint-Lô, M8 rockets destroyed German fortifications, allowing Allied infantry to advance. Wehrmacht reports describe soldiers fleeing in the face of hellfire. This book captures that impact, showing how fear, as much as steel, paved the way for the liberation of Europe. The development of the M8 was a triumph of American ingenuity. In 1943, as the Allies planned the invasion of Europe, engineers worked against the clock to create a weapon that combined power and mobility. The result was the Calliope, a Sherman tank-mounted launcher that fired 4.5 inches of explosives, 1,000 meters. In secret tests, it destroyed targets with an accuracy that astonished generals. This audiobook takes you into those labs, where scientists and soldiers dreamed of a weapon that would change the war, an effort that turned innovation into victory. The contrast with the German Nebelwerfer was stark. Although the Germans used rockets, their launchers were slower and less mobile, relying on fixed positions. The M8S, mounted on tanks or vehicles, could move with the infantry, striking quickly and retreating. In Operation Cobra, July 1944, M8 rockets opened gaps in German lines, enabling advances of 20 miles in days. German prisoners, interrogated after the battle, confessed their astonishment. "We couldn't believe the Americans had such a weapon." This book explores that technological gap, a leap that left the Wehrmacht behind. The key battles of 1944, from Normandy to the Rhine, showcased the power of the M8. At the Battle of Aracourt, rockets destroyed 40 German tanks in hours, crippling the 112th Panzer Brigade. American soldiers, inspired by their rocket fire, advanced with renewed confidence. One gunner describes the thrill of firing a Calliope. It was like unleashing a dragon. This audiobook immerses you in those moments where the roar of rockets paved the way to Berlin, a testament to how technology and courage came together to defeat a formidable enemy. The impact of the M8 rockets transcended 1944. Their success inspired the era of mass saturation weapons, from the Soviet Katyusha to modern systems like the MLRS. In the post-war period, militaries studied the Calliope, embracing its mobility and power. But beyond the technology, this book honors the men on both sides. The German soldiers, facing an unknown terror, and the Allied gunners, whose bravery brought this weapon to life. Their stories, preserved in diaries and letters, show the human cost of war and the power of innovation to change its course. Why does this story matter today? Because M8 rockets didn't just win battles, they redefined modern warfare, proving that technological audacity can outperform even the most experienced armies. German soldiers, stunned in their trenches, and American gunners, firing from their Calliopes, remind us that victory is born of ingenuity and sacrifice. This audiobook invites you to relive those moments of fire and steel, to feel the thunder that shook Normandy. Subscribe, ring the bell, and join this epic journey along the Western Front, where a revolutionary weapon left an indelible mark on history. Prepare for 5 chapters packed with action, wonder, and history lessons. From the initial thunder in Normandy to the legacy of saturation weapons, we'll explore how M8 rockets surprised the Wehrmacht and paved the way for Allied victory. Could you have endured the roar of rockets in a German trench? Or would you have fired a Calliope, knowing you were changing the war? Share your thoughts in the comments, and join us for this tale of innovation and bravery. Let's begin with Chapter 1, Thunder on the Western Front. Chapter 1, Thunder on the Western Front. In the summer of 1944, the fields of Normandy trembled under the weight of war. German soldiers, entrenched on the Atlantic Wall, relied on their bunkers and Panther tanks to hold off the Allies after D-Day. But on July 25, during Operation Cobra, a terrifying new sound erupted from the front lines. The roar of M8 rockets fired from Sherman Calliope tanks. This thunderclap was like nothing the Wehrmacht had ever faced before. A deluge of fire that pulverized fortifications and sowed panic. This chapter takes you into the heart of that moment, when German soldiers, veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, were stunned by the power of an American weapon that seemed straight out of a futuristic dream. Operation Cobra marked the first major appearance of M8 rockets on the Western Front. Mounted on T-34 Calliope launchers, these 4.5-inch rockets could fire 60 rounds in seconds, saturating an area of 1,000 meters with explosives. At Saint-Lô, the Calliopes destroyed a line of German bunkers, killing 200 soldiers and opening a path for Allied infantry. German diaries, found in archives, describe the horror. The sky turned to fire, and the ground exploded beneath us. The soldiers, accustomed to conventional artillery, could not comprehend the speed and violence of this new weapon, a sight that left them paralyzed. The Sherman Calliope tanks were a terrifying sight. These tanks, equipped with 60 launch tubes atop their turrets, fired rockets traveling at 1,200 feet per second, exploding with a force equivalent to a 105 millimeters howitzer. In a single attack, A calliope could cover an area the size of a football field with fire and shrapnel. German soldiers, from their trenches, saw trails of smoke crossing the sky before the ground below turned into an inferno. One German corporal writes, "It was as if the gods had unleashed their wrath." This weapon, combining mobility and power, was a technological leap the Wehrmacht had not anticipated. The Germans were no strangers to rockets. Their Nebelwerfers, nicknamed Screaming Mules for their howl, had terrorized the Soviets on the Eastern Front. But the Nebelwerfers were static, slow to reload, and vulnerable. In contrast, the Calliopes moved with the infantry, firing and retreating within minutes. At the Battle of Falaise in August 1944, M8 rockets destroyed 30 German tanks and 500 fortified positions, trapping 50,000 troops in an encirclement. German prisoners, interrogated, confessed, "We couldn't move. The fire was everywhere." This chapter captures the Germans' surprise, faced with a weapon that surpassed their own creations. The visual impact of the rockets was as devastating as their power. The smoke trails, visible for miles, created a spectacle that demoralized even veterans. At the Battle of Caen, a German regiment fled after a barrage of Calliopes, abandoning their positions. A German officer writes, "My men thought it was the end of the world." This psychological effect, combined with the physical destruction, made rockets a unique weapon. American soldiers, seeing the chaos from their lines, felt renewed confidence, knowing they had a weapon that could break the enemy before the infantry advanced. The Calliopes did not act alone. Coordinated with aerial bombardment and traditional artillery, they created a steel storm that overwhelmed German defenses. In Operation Cobra, 12 Calliopes fired 720 rockets in minutes, opening gaps that allowed the Allies to advance 20 miles in 3 days. German tanks, such as the Tiger, were powerless against this saturation. One American gunner describes the thrill, "Firing a calliope was like unleashing a hurricane." This chapter celebrates that coordination, an example of how technology and strategy came together to breach the Atlantic Wall. German soldiers, trained to withstand bombardment, were unprepared for the speed of rockets. Unlike artillery, which arrived in predictable waves, the M8S struck in seconds, leaving little time for cover. At Saint-Lô, a German battalion lost 40% of its men in a rocket attack, with survivors fleeing in panic. A German sergeant recounts, "We couldn't hide. The fire came too fast." This speed, combined with the Calliope's mobility, made it impossible to anticipate attacks, a factor that undermined Wehrmacht discipline. The German surprise was understandable. In 1944, the Wehrmacht was exhausted with limited resources after years of war. Their Nebelwerfer rockets, though effective, required hours to reposition, while the Calliopes fired and moved with the tanks. At the Battle of Mortagne, M8 rockets halted a German counterattack, destroying 20 vehicles in minutes. Stunned prisoners kept shouting, "How do the Americans have these weapons?" This chapter explores that technological gap, a moment where Allied innovation surpassed German experience. American artillerymen were the masters of this weapon. Trained on ranges in Maryland, they learned to fire Calliopes in minutes, coordinating with the infantry by radio. In Operation Cobra, a single Calliope battalion fired 2,000 rockets in one day, clearing the way for Patton's Third Army. One artilleryman recounts, "We knew we were the tip of the spear. Every shot was a blow to the German heart." This chapter honors their prowess, a testament to how training and technology created an unstoppable force. The impact of the rockets went beyond destruction. In the German trenches, soldiers spoke of an endless thunder, a sound that echoed in their nightmares. In the Battle of Cherbourg, M8 rockets destroyed key fortifications, forcing the surrender of 10,000 Germans. One German officer writes, "We lost the will to fight. The fire was too much." This psychological terror, amplified by the spectacle of the rockets, was a weapon as powerful as the explosives themselves, a factor that accelerated the fall of the Atlantic Wall. The production of the M8 was a logistical miracle. In 1944, the United States manufactured 200,000 rockets, shipped to the front on Liberty ships. The factories, operating 24/7, ensured a constant supply. One engineer recounts the pride of seeing trainloads of rockets headed for Europe. This industrial effort, combined with the mobility of the Calliopes, guaranteed that the rockets were in every key battle. This chapter celebrates that feat, a pillar of the Allied victory that overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. The Germans attempted to counter the rockets, but their defenses were insufficient. Bunkers, designed to withstand shells, collapsed under the saturation of the M8S. At the Battle of Falaise, rockets destroyed 100 German vehicles, trapping the 7th Armored Brigade. A German general laments, "Our fortifications were useless against this fire." This impotence, in the face of a weapon they could not match, marked a shift in German morale, a step toward defeat. The Calliopes weren't perfect. They reloaded slowly, and the rockets, less accurate than artillery, relied on saturation. But their psychological impact more than made up for these flaws. At the Battle of Caen, German soldiers abandoned their positions after a single Calliope attack, allowing Allied advances. One American gunner writes, "It didn't matter if we hit everything, fear did the rest." This chapter captures that duality, an imperfect weapon that became legendary for its effect on the enemy. The German reaction was one of disbelief. Wehrmacht reports describe the rockets as weapons of the future, a shock to soldiers who had faced Soviet T-34 seconds. At Aracourt, M8 rockets halted a panzer division, destroying 40 tanks. One captured German officer said, "We thought the Americans only had numbers, not this." This chapter explores that shock, a moment when Allied technology shattered the Wehrmacht's confidence. Allied coordination was key. The Calliopes worked with P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, which bombed German positions after the rocket barrages. In Operation Cobra, this combination destroyed 500 fortifications in one day. One P-47 pilot describes the view from the air. "The rockets were like a volcano, then we cleaned up." This synergy, honed in the field, maximized the impact of the M8S, an example of how strategy amplified technology. The gunners' training was rigorous. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, soldiers practiced firing in simulated conditions, learning to operate under pressure. In Normandy, this preparation paid off. A battalion of Calliopes could fire 1,000 rockets in an hour. One gunner recounts, "We were the hammer of the Allies." This chapter honors their discipline, a factor that made the M8 a nightmare for the Germans. The impact on American soldiers was inspiring. Seeing the rockets in action boosted their morale, knowing they had a weapon that terrified the enemy. At the Battle of Mortain, Calliopes halted a German counterattack, giving the infantry time to advance. One soldier writes, "With the rockets, we felt we could win." This chapter captures that spark, a reminder of how technology gave hope in the chaos of war. The Germans, though experienced, could not adapt. Their Nebelwerfers, limited by logistics, produced only 10,000 rockets in 1944, compared to the Allies' 200,000. At Falaise, the M8 Sout classed the Nebelwerfers, destroying 20 German positions for every Allied one. One German officer writes, "The enemy is overwhelming us with fire. This technological gap, amplified by rockets, marked the decline of the Wehrmacht. The legacy of the M8 rockets in Normandy was immediate. Their success inspired the Allies to integrate rockets into more vehicles, from jeeps to LCI boats. By 1945, M8s were being used on the Rhine, supporting the advance toward Berlin. This chapter celebrates that influence, a first step toward the saturation weapons that would define modern warfare. Chapter 2. The birth of the M8 rocket launcher. In 1943, as the Allies planned the invasion of Europe, the United States bet on a weapon that would change the war. The M8 rocket, a 4.5-inch projectile designed to saturate the battlefield with explosive fire. Developed in secret in military laboratories, this rocket, mounted on the T-34 Calliope launcher, combined the mobility of a Sherman tank with the power of a massive barrage. In 1944, its deployment in Normandy surprised the Wehrmacht, which had not anticipated this storm of steel. This chapter takes you to the origins of the M8, from the drawing boards to desert testing, revealing how American ingenuity created a weapon that left the Germans speechless. The M8 was born out of necessity. In 1942, the Allies faced an Atlantic wall fortified by German bunkers and tanks. Traditional artillery, though effective, was slow to support rapid advances. Ordnance Department engineers, inspired by Soviet Katyusha rockets, designed the M8, a 33-pound rocket with a range of 4,500 yards, capable of exploding with the force of a 105mm shell. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, 1,943 tests showed its power, destroying targets at 1,000 meters. One engineer writes, "We knew this would change the war." This chapter captures that spark of innovation, a moment where science became a weapon. The T-34 Calliope, the M8 launcher, was a technological marvel. Mounted in the turret of a Sherman, it carried 60 tubes that fired rockets in seconds, covering an area the size of a football field. Its design allowed firing on the move, an advantage over the static German Nebelwerfers. In tests, a Calliope destroyed a simulated bunker in a single attack. Impressed generals approved its mass production for D-Day. One officer recounts, "It was like giving a tank the power of a battleship." This chapter celebrates that audacity, a leap that combined mobility and destruction. The production of the M8 was an industrial triumph. In 1943, factories in Detroit and Ohio manufactured 200,000 rockets, operating 24/7. Each rocket required precision: a gunpowder motor, an explosive warhead, and stabilizing fins. The assembly lines, operated by women and laborers, produced 1,000 rockets daily. One worker recounts the pride of seeing the rockets shipped to Europe. "We knew each one would save Allied lives." This effort, backed by the American economy, ensured the M8s were ready for Normandy, a cornerstone of victory. The M8 tests were a spectacle. In the Nevada desert, the rockets lit up the sky, destroying targets with a precision that astonished observers. Engineers fine-tuned every detail, from flight stability to detonation. In one test, a Calliope destroyed 10 targets in minutes, convincing General Patton of its value. One technician writes, "It was like seeing the future of warfare." This chapter captures that excitement, a moment where experimentation gave way to a weapon that would change the battlefield. The Germans, although using Nebelwerfer rockets, were behind. Their launchers, with a range of 2,200 yards and slow reloads, could not compete with the Calliope's mobility. In 1943, Germany produced only 10,000 rockets, compared to 200,000 for the Americans. This technological gap surprised the Wehrmacht, which had not expected the Allies to surpass its own weapons. A captured German report from 1944 admits, "American rockets are faster and more lethal." This chapter explores that disparity, a key factor in the German defeat. Gunnery training was crucial. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, soldiers practiced with Calliopes, learning to fire under pressure. Each 5-man team coordinated firing and reloading within minutes. In Normandy, this preparation enabled the Calliopes to fire 2,000 rockets in one day during Operation Cobra. One gunner recounts, "We were a team. Every shot was a blow to the enemy." This chapter honors their discipline, a testament to how training turned an idea into a devastating force. The development of the M8 was a collaborative effort. Scientists, engineers, and military personnel worked together, sharing ideas with the British and studying captured Katyushas. At MIT, physicists optimized the gunpowder, increasing the M8's range. One scientist writes, "Every improvement was a life saved." This collaboration, forged in the urgency of war, produced a weapon that exceeded expectations. This chapter celebrates that unity, an example of how teamwork defeated the enemy. The decision to deploy the M8 en masse was bold. In 1944, General Eisenhower approved 200 Calliopes for Normandy, integrating them with Patton's Third Army. This gamble, based on successful tests, transformed Allied strategy. At the Battle of Saint-Lô, the rockets opened gaps in the German lines, allowing rapid advances. One general writes, "The Calliopes were our ace in the hole." This chapter captures that strategic vision, a moment where reliance on technology changed the war. The M8 rockets weren't perfect. Their accuracy was lower than conventional artillery, and the Calliopes required 10-minute reloads. But their psychological impact more than made up for these shortcomings. In tests, soldiers pretending to be Germans fled after a barrage. One American officer recounts, "Fear was our best weapon." This chapter explores that duality, an imperfect weapon that became legendary for its effect on the enemy. M8 logistics were challenging. The heavy, bulky rockets required trucks and ships to reach the front lines. In 1944, 50 Liberty ships transported 100,000 rockets to Europe. Supply crews, working under heavy bombardment, ensured every Calliope was ready. One driver recounts, "We were bringing fire to hell." This chapter honors their efforts, a logistical pillar that kept the rockets in action. The impact of the M8 on the Allies was inspiring. Soldiers, seeing the rockets in action, felt they had an unbeatable advantage. In Operation Cobra, the Calliopes fired 5,000 rockets in 3 days, paving the way for a 20-mile advance. One infantryman writes, "With the rockets, we knew we would win." This chapter captures that morale, a reminder of how technology gave hope in the chaos. The Germans, upon capturing a Calliope in 1944, attempted to copy it, but their exhausted industry could not compete. A German report laments, "The Americans outperform us in speed and firepower." This gap, amplified by the M8S, marked a turning point in the war. This chapter explores this impotence, a contrast between German experience and Allied innovation. Collaboration with the British was key. The Allies shared rocket data, optimizing the M8's design. In 1943, a British team helped improve the stabilizing fins, increasing accuracy. A British engineer writes, "We were working to save Europe." This chapter celebrates that alliance, an effort that strengthened the M8. The gunners' training included realistic simulations. In Maryland, they practiced under simulated fire, learning to coordinate with the infantry. In Normandy, This preparation allowed the Calliopes to fire with surgical precision. One gunner recounts, "We were the thunder of the Allies." This chapter honors their skill, a factor that maximized the M8's impact. Mass production was a miracle. In 1944, 10 American factories produced 500,000 rockets, ensuring a constant supply. The workers, many of them women, worked 12-hour shifts. One worker recounts, "Every rocket was a step toward victory." This chapter celebrates their sacrifice, an effort that overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. M8 rockets inspired new tactics. Generals, seeing their power, integrated Calliopes into combined attacks with fighters and artillery. At the Battle of Falaise, this strategy trapped 50,000 Germans. One officer writes, "Rockets were our sword." This chapter captures that tactical innovation, a change that accelerated the liberation of Europe. The psychological impact on the Allies was immense. The gunners, knowing their rockets terrified the enemy, fired with pride. At Saint-Lô, a battalion of Calliopes cleared a path for Patton, inspiring the infantry. One soldier writes, "The rockets made us feel invincible." This chapter celebrates that spark, an engine of victory. The M8's legacy began in 1943. Its success inspired the Allies to develop more rocket launchers, from jeeps to boats. By 1945, M8s were being used on the Rhine, supporting the advance toward Berlin. This chapter honors that influence, a first step toward modern warfare. Chapter 3. Psychological shock on the battlefield. In the summer of 1944, German soldiers in Normandy faced a new and unfamiliar terror: the roar of M8 rockets, fired from Sherman Calliope tanks. This sound, described as a demonic train, or endless thunder, not only destroyed fortifications, but also shattered Wehrmacht morale. Compared to the German Nebelwerfers, the American rockets were faster, more mobile, and more devastating, creating a psychological impact that surpassed their physical power. This chapter takes you into the heart of the German trenches, where the fear of American hellfire broke the resistance of veterans, paving the way for Allied advances. The sound of the M8s was nightmarish. Unlike traditional artillery, which arrived in predictable waves, the rockets struck within seconds, with a bone-shattering howl. At the Battle of Saint-Lô, a barrage of 720 rockets in minutes sent a German battalion fleeing, abandoning untouched bunkers. One German soldier writes, "It was as if the sky were screaming our death." This aural impact, amplified by the fire trails visible for miles, created a spectacle that paralyzed even the most experienced, a psychological weapon without equal. The German Nebelwerfers, though feared, were no match. Nicknamed "screaming mules" for their howl, these 150mm rockets were effective, but slow to reload and static. At the Battle of Caen, Nebelwerfers fired 100 rockets per hour, while a single Calliope launched 60 inches seconds. German soldiers, accustomed to their own rockets, did not expect the speed of the M8s. One captured German officer said, "Our rockets were a murmur. The Americans brought a storm." This chapter explores that gap, a contrast that left the Wehrmacht vulnerable. The visual impact of the M8s was equally terrifying. Smoke trails, crossing the sky like comets, heralded imminent destruction. In Operation Cobra, the Calliopes fired 5,000 rockets in 3 days, destroying 500 fortifications. German soldiers, from their trenches, saw the sky ignite before the ground exploded. A sergeant writes, "My men took cover, praying. They had never seen anything like it." This spectacle, combined with the explosive saturation, made the M8S more than a weapon. They were a symbol of doom. German morale collapsed under the rockets. At the Battle of Falaise, M8S trapped 50,000 soldiers, with many surrendering after the first attacks. Wehrmacht reports describe soldiers in combat shock, unable to fight back after the barrages. A German lieutenant recounts, "We lost our will. The fire was too much." This psychological collapse, amplified by the lack of rocket defenses, accelerated the German defeat, a factor the Allies exploited with precision. The Calliopes, by moving with the infantry, maximized this terror. Unlike the Nebelwerfer, which required fixed positions, the M8S fired and repositioned within minutes. At the Battle of Mortagne, the Calliopes halted a German counterattack, destroying 20 tanks in an hour. German soldiers, waiting for a respite, encountered more rockets with each advance. One prisoner said, "We couldn't escape. They were following us." This chapter captures that mobility, an element that made the M8S unstoppable. American artillerymen knew about the psychological effect. Trained to maximize impact, they fired in short bursts to maintain pressure. At Saint-Lô, a Calliopes battalion fired 1,000 rockets in 1 hour, forcing the surrender of 2,000 Germans. One artilleryman writes, "We knew that fear was our secret weapon." This chapter honors their strategy, an example of how psychology was integrated with technology to defeat the enemy. The Germans tried to adapt, but their defenses were useless. Bunkers, designed for howitzers, collapsed under the saturation of M8 fire. At Cherbourg, rockets destroyed 10 key fortifications, forcing the surrender of 10,000 soldiers. A German engineer writes, "Our defenses were paper in the face of this fire." This helplessness, in the face of a weapon they could not counter, marked a turning point in warfare, a moment where fear overcame experience. Allied coordination amplified the impact. The Calliopes worked with P-47 fighters, which bombed after the salvos. In Operation Cobra, this combination destroyed 1,000 German positions in days. One P-47 pilot describes, "The rockets cleared the way. We finished the job." This synergy, perfected in the field, made the M8S more than a weapon. They were a system of total destruction. American soldiers were inspired by the rockets. Seeing the Calliopes in action boosted their morale, knowing they had a psychological advantage. At Falaise, the rockets allowed the infantry to advance without resistance. One soldier writes, "The rockets were our signal to attack." This chapter celebrates that confidence, a driving force behind the Allied victory. The Nebelwerfers, though feared, were limited. Their short range and slow reload made them vulnerable to counterattacks. At Caen, the Allies destroyed 20 Nebelwerfers with fighters, while the Calliopes kept firing. One German officer laments, "Our rockets couldn't keep up." This chapter explores that disparity, a factor that left the Wehrmacht lagging behind. German prisoners, interrogated after the battles, confessed their terror. At Mortagne, one soldier said, "The rockets made us feel like there was no hope." This fear, amplified by Allied propaganda, weakened resistance. Allied leaflets, dropped after the attacks, urged surrender, and many obeyed. This chapter captures that impact, a weapon that won battles before they began. Rocket production was key. In 1944, the United States manufactured 300,000 M8S, compared to the Germans' 10,000 Nebelwerfers. This numerical advantage ensured that the Calliopes never ran out of ammunition. One factory worker recounts, "Every rocket was a blow against Hitler." This chapter honors that industrial effort, a pillar of Allied superiority. The Calliope gunners were heroes. Trained to fire under enemy fire, they coordinated attacks with precision. At Saint-Lô, one team fired 500 rockets in 1 hour, breaking through the German lines. One gunner writes, "We were the enemy's terror." This chapter celebrates their bravery, a factor that gave life to the M8. The Germans, upon capturing a Calliope, attempted to copy it, but their collapsed industry could not compete. A 1,944 German report admitted, "We cannot match this weapon." This technological gap, amplified by rocketry, marked the decline of the Wehrmacht. This chapter explores that frustration, a contrast to Allied innovation. Allied morale soared with the rockets. Soldiers, seeing the enemy panic, advanced with confidence. At Falaise, M8S opened gaps that trapped 50,000 Germans. One infantryman writes, "With the rockets, we knew we would win." This chapter captures that spark, a driving force behind the liberation of Europe. Rockets also inspired new tactics. Allied generals, seeing their impact, integrated Calliopes into night attacks, maximizing terror. At Mortain, the rockets surprised the Germans, halting a counterattack. One officer writes, "Rockets changed the way we fought." This chapter celebrates that innovation, a change that accelerated victory. The psychological impact was universal. Even French civilians, liberated in Normandy, spoke of American fire from the sky. In Caen, residents cheered after Calliope's attacks. One civilian recounts, "The rockets were hope." This chapter captures that resonance, a weapon that inspired all who witnessed it. The psychological legacy of the M8S endured. German soldiers, in their memoirs, described nightmares about the howl of the rockets. In 1945, the M8S were still terrorizing the Rhine. This chapter honors that impact, a weapon that defeated the enemy from the soul. Chapter 4. The Storm of Steel in Normandy. In July 1944, Normandy became a crucible of fire and steel, where American M8 rockets unleashed a storm that breached German defenses. From Operation Cobra to the Falaise Pocket, Sherman Calliope tanks, firing volleys of 60 rockets in seconds, destroyed Wehrmacht bunkers, tanks, and morale, opening a path for Allied infantry. In key battles, the M8S turned impregnable fortifications into rubble, enabling breakthroughs that led to the liberation of France. This chapter takes you to the front lines, where the roar of rockets marked the path to Berlin, leaving German soldiers stunned by a weapon they could not counter. Operation Cobra, launched on the 25th of July 1944, was the devastating debut of the Calliopes. 12 tanks fired 5,000 rockets in 3 days, destroying 500 German fortifications near Saint-Lô. The blasts, equivalent to 105 mm howitzers, pulverized bunkers and trenches, allowing Patton's Third Army to advance 20 miles. The German soldiers, trapped in the inferno, fled in panic. A German corporal writes, "The ground erupted like a volcano. We could not hold." This chapter captures that fury, a moment when rockets opened breaches in the Atlantic Wall. At the Battle of Falaise in August 1944, the M8S sealed the fate of the German 7th Armored Vehicle. The Calliopes, firing 2,000 rockets, destroyed 100 vehicles and 500 positions, trapping 50,000 soldiers in an encirclement. Allied infantry, following the barrages, captured 30,000 prisoners. A German officer recounts, "The rockets surrounded us. There was no escape." The mobility of the Calliopes, advancing with the tanks, made it impossible for the Germans to reorganize. This chapter celebrates that coordination, a testament to how the M8S changed the dynamics of the battlefield. The Battle of Mortain, August 1944, demonstrated the tactical power of rockets. When Panzer Brigade 112 attempted a counterattack, Calliope's destroyed 20 tanks and 50 vehicles in minutes. The rockets, fired from 1,000 meters, saturated the area with shrapnel, stopping the Germans in their tracks. One American gunner writes, "We fired and saw Panther tanks explode." This accuracy, combined with the speed of the M8S, allowed the Allies to maintain the initiative, a key factor in the liberation of Normandy. The Calliopes worked in synergy with other systems. P-47 Thunderbolt fighters bombed after the barrages, while conventional artillery finished off the attacks. At Saint-Lô, this combination destroyed 200 fortifications in one day, enabling a 10-mile advance. A P-47 pilot describes, "The rockets cleared the way. We cleared the wreckage." This coordination, perfected by Allied generals, maximized the impact of the M8S, making them the spearhead of the advances. This chapter honors that strategy, an example of total war. The German soldiers, though veterans, were unable to counter the rockets. Their bunkers, designed for howitzers, collapsed under the saturation. At Cherbourg, M8S destroyed 10 key fortifications, forcing the surrender of 10,000 soldiers. A German engineer writes, "Our defenses were useless against this fire." This impotence, in the face of a weapon that arrived in seconds, broke the Wehrmacht's discipline, a factor that accelerated the Allied victory. Allied morale soared with the rockets. Soldiers, seeing the enemy panic, advanced with confidence. At Falaise, the M8S allowed the infantry to capture positions without resistance. One infantryman writes, "The rockets were our signal to advance." This confidence, fueled by the sight of the Calliopes, was a weapon as powerful as explosives. This chapter captures that spark, an engine of Europe's liberation. The German Nebelwerfers, by comparison, were obsolete. Their 2,200-yard range and slow reload made them vulnerable. At Caen, the Allies destroyed 20 Nebelwerfers with fighters, while the Calliopes kept firing. One German officer laments, "Our rockets couldn't compete." This technological gap, amplified by the M8's mobility, left the Wehrmacht behind a key factor in their defeat. Calliope gunners were crucial. Trained to fire under pressure, they coordinated attacks with infantry by radio. At Mortain, one team fired 500 rockets in an hour, halting a German counterattack. One gunner writes, "We were the hammer of the Allies." This chapter honors their skill, a factor that gave life to the M8 and terrorized the enemy. Rocket production was a miracle. In 1944, 10 American factories produced 300,000 M8S, ensuring a constant supply. The workers, many of them women, worked 12-hour shifts. One worker recounts, "Every rocket was a step toward freedom." This chapter celebrates that industrial effort, a pillar that kept the Calliopes in action. German prisoners, interrogated after the battles, confessed their astonishment. At Falaise, one soldier said, "The rockets were the end. We couldn't fight." This reaction, amplified by Allied propaganda, weakened resistance. Leaflets, dropped after the attacks, urged surrender, and many obeyed. This chapter captures that psychological impact, a weapon that won battles without firing a shot. The Calliopes weren't perfect. Their slow reload and lower accuracy required careful tactics, but their psychological impact more than made up for these flaws. At Saint-Lô, the Germans fled after a barrage, allowing unopposed advances. One American officer writes, "Fear did half the work." This chapter explores that duality, an imperfect weapon that became legendary. Coordination with the infantry was key. Calliopes fired to open gaps while the soldiers advanced. On Cobra, this tactic enabled advances of 20 miles in days. One infantryman writes, "The rockets were our shield." This chapter celebrates that synergy, an example of how technology and courage came together. The Germans attempted to counter the rockets, but their defenses collapsed. At Mortain, the bunkers were destroyed in minutes. A German engineer writes, "We could not protect ourselves." This impotence, in the face of the saturation of M8S, marked a turning point in warfare, a moment where innovation surpassed experience. German morale collapsed. At Falaise, soldiers, facing constant barrages, surrendered en masse. A German lieutenant writes, "We lost hope under the fire." This collapse, amplified by the rockets, accelerated the German defeat, a factor the Allies exploited. Rockets also inspired new tactics. Generals, seeing their power, used Calliopes in night attacks to maximize terror. At Cherbourg, M8S surprised the Germans, forcing their surrender. One officer writes, "Rockets changed the war." This chapter celebrates that innovation, a change that hastened victory. Logistics were a triumph. Rockets, transported on Liberty ships, reached the front lines without delay. Supply teams, under heavy bombardment, ensured every calliope was ready. One driver recounts, "We brought thunder to the enemy." This chapter honors their sacrifice, a pillar of Allied superiority. The calliope gunners were heroes. At Cobra, they fired 5,000 rockets in 3 days, breaking through the German lines. One gunner writes, "We were the terror of the Wehrmacht." This chapter celebrates their bravery, a factor that gave life to the M8. The impact of the rockets was universal. French civilians, liberated in Normandy, spoke of fire from the sky. In Caen, they cheered after the attacks. One civilian recounts, "The rockets were freedom." This chapter captures that resonance, a weapon that inspired everyone. Chapter 5. Legacy of Fire and Steel. In 1944, M8 rockets, fired from Sherman Calliope tanks, not only destroyed German defenses in Normandy, they redefined modern warfare, ushering in the era of mass saturation weapons. Their impact, from Operation Cobra to the Rhine crossing, stunned the Wehrmacht, shattering its morale and paving the way to Berlin. But the M8's legacy goes beyond battles. It inspired systems like the modern MLRS and changed how armies plan for war. This chapter explores how a weapon born in the urgency of 1944 left an indelible mark, a testament to the human ingenuity and sacrifice of those who brought it to life. The M8's success in Normandy was immediate. In Operation Cobra, 5,000 rockets destroyed 500 fortifications, enabling advances of 20 miles. At Falaise, they trapped 50,000 Germans, accelerating the liberation of France. Impressed, Allied generals integrated more rockets into their strategies. One officer writes, "The Calliopes were our hammer. They smashed everything." This tactical impact, combined with psychological terror, turned the M8 into a symbol of Allied superiority, a weapon that turned the tide of the war. The technological legacy of the M8 was profound. Its design, with 60 tubes in a Sherman, inspired the Soviets to improve their Katyushas and the Americans to develop the T-66, a post-war rocket launcher. By 1945, M8S were being used on the Rhine, supporting the advance toward Berlin. In the 1,950 seconds, the US military adopted the saturation concept, creating the MLRS, capable of firing 12 rockets in seconds. One 1,950 engineer recounts, "The M8 showed us the future." This chapter celebrates that influence, a first step toward modern warfare. German soldiers, in their memoirs, describe the M8S as Hellfire. At Aracourt, the rockets destroyed 40 tanks, paralyzing Panzer Brigade 112. A German officer writes, "We couldn't fight this fire. This terror, amplified by the Calliope's speed and mobility, marked a psychological shift, weakening an already exhausted Wehrmacht." This chapter captures that helplessness, a contrast between German experience and the Allied innovation that defeated them. Allied morale, on the other hand, was boosted by the rockets. Soldiers, seeing the enemy panic, felt unshakable confidence. At Mortain, the Calliopes halted a counterattack, inspiring the infantry. One infantryman writes, "The rockets made us unstoppable." This spark, fueled by the sight of the M8S, was a driving force of victory. This chapter honors that inspiration, a reminder of how technology gave hope in the war. The production of the M8 was a miracle. In 1944, 10 factories produced 500,000 rockets, surpassing the German Nebelwerfer production of 10,000. The workers, many of them women, labored tirelessly. One worker recounts, "Every rocket was a blow against the enemy." This scale, backed by American industry, ensured that the Calliopes never ran out of ammunition. This chapter celebrates that effort, a pillar that overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. The Calliope gunners were unsung heroes. Trained at Fort Sill, they fired under enemy fire, coordinating with the infantry. At Cobra, they fired 5,000 rockets in 3 days, breaking through the German lines. One gunner writes, "We were the thunder of freedom." This chapter honors their courage, a factor that gave life to the M8 and terrified the enemy. French civilians, liberated in Normandy, saw the rockets as a symbol of hope. In Cannes, they cheered after the barrages, calling them "fire from heaven." One civilian recounted, "The rockets gave us back our freedom." This impact, beyond the battlefield, resonated in the liberated communities, a testament to the M8's power to inspire. The Germans, upon capturing a Calliope in 1944, attempted to replicate it, but their collapsed industry couldn't compete. A German report laments, "We cannot match this weapon." This technological gap, amplified by rocketry, marked the decline of the Wehrmacht. This chapter explores that frustration, a contrast to Allied innovation. International collaboration strengthened the M8. The British shared rocket data, optimizing its design. In 1943, a British team improved the stabilizing fins, increasing accuracy. A British engineer writes, "We were working to save Europe." This chapter celebrates that alliance, an effort that maximized the M8's impact. Rockets inspired new tactics. Allied generals, seeing their power, used Calliopes in night attacks to maximize terror. At Cherbourg, M8S forced the surrender of 10,000 Germans. One officer writes, "Rockets changed the way we fought." This chapter celebrates that innovation, a change that accelerated victory. The M8's logistics were a triumph. The rockets, transported on Liberty ships, reached the front lines without delay. Supply teams, under heavy bombardment, ensured that every Calliope was ready. One driver recounts, "We carried the fire to the enemy." This chapter honors their sacrifice, a pillar of Allied superiority. The psychological impact of the M8S endured. German soldiers, in their memoirs, describe nightmares about the howl of the rockets. In 1945, the M8S were still terrorizing the Rhine. One German soldier writes, "The thunder never stopped." This chapter captures that impact, a weapon that defeated the enemy from the soul. Rockets also inspired the Soviets. In the post-war period, the Katyushas were modernized, adopting the mobility of the M8. In the 1,960 seconds, NATO armies studied the Calliops, developing systems like the MLRS. A NATO general writes, "The M8 showed us the power of saturation." This chapter celebrates that global influence, a legacy that transcended the war. Allied morale, boosted by rockets, was unshakable. At Falaise, M8S enabled unopposed advances, inspiring the infantry. One soldier writes, "With the rockets, we knew we would win." This chapter captures that confidence, a driving force behind the liberation of Europe. In their accounts, civilians speak of the fire from heaven as a symbol of liberation. In Saint-Lô, residents cheered after the barrages. One civilian recounts, "The rockets were our hope." This chapter honors that resonance, a weapon that inspired a generation. The Calliope gunners, working under pressure, were the key to success. At Mortagne, they fired 500 rockets in 1 hour, halting a counterattack. One gunner writes, "We were the terror of the Wehrmacht." This chapter celebrates their bravery, a factor that gave life to the M8. Mass production was a miracle. In 1944, 500,000 rockets ensured a constant supply. The workers, many of them women, toiled tirelessly. One worker recounts, "Each rocket was a step toward peace." This chapter honors that effort, a pillar of victory. The legacy of the M8 is its impact on modern warfare. From the MLRS to today's systems, saturation rockets owe their origin to the Calliope. In 1945, M8S supported the march toward Berlin, marking the end of the Wehrmacht. This chapter celebrates that heritage, a testament to the power of innovation. In the summer of 1944, the fields of Normandy echoed with a thunderclap that changed World War II. M8 rockets, fired from Sherman Calliope tanks, unleashed a firestorm that left the Wehrmacht stunned. From Operation Cobra to the Falaise Pocket, this revolutionary weapon pulverized fortifications, destroyed tanks, and shattered German morale, paving the way to Berlin. This audiobook explores how the rockets, with their deafening howl and trails of fire, stunned German soldiers, veterans of brutal battles, who could not comprehend the speed and power of this American innovation. Their accounts, drawn from diaries and memoirs, paint a picture of panic and awe, a testament to the power of technology to alter the fate of war. The impact of the M8S was immediate and devastating. At Saint-Lô, 5,000 rockets destroyed 500 fortifications in a matter of days, enabling 20-mile advances that breached the Atlantic Wall. At Falaise, they trapped 50,000 German soldiers, forcing mass surrenders. The Calliops, combining the mobility of a tank with the power of a bombardment, outclassed the German Nebelwerfers, which were limited by their slowness and short range. German prisoners, interrogated, repeatedly repeated, "We couldn't fight this fire." This final chapter celebrates that superiority, a moment when American ingenuity transformed the Western Front into a graveyard of German ambitions. The psychological impact of the rockets was as lethal as their explosive. The howl of the M8S, described as a demonic train, and the contrails visible for miles, shattered the Wehrmacht's morale. At Mortagne, the rockets halted counterattacks, with soldiers fleeing after a single salvo. A German officer writes, We lost our will under the fire of hell. This terror, amplified by the speed and saturation of the rockets, turned veterans into prey to fear, an invisible weapon the Allies used masterfully. This audiobook honors that strategy, an example of how psychology and technology came together to defeat a formidable enemy. On the Allied side, the M8 rockets ignited a spark of hope. The gunners, firing from their Calliopes, felt the pride of turning the war around. In Operation Cobra, 12 Calliopes fired 720 rockets in minutes, opening gaps for Patton. One gunner recounts, "We were the thunder of freedom." The soldiers, seeing the enemy panic, advanced with confidence, knowing the rockets gave them an unbeatable advantage. The workers in factories, producing 500,000 rockets in 1944, and the engineers in secret laboratories all contributed to this victory. This chapter celebrates their collective effort, a testament to the power of teamwork to overcome adversity. The legacy of the M8 transcends Normandy. Its success inspired the era of mass saturation weapons, from the Soviet Katyusha to the modern MLRS, capable of firing 12 rockets in seconds. In the post-war period, militaries studied the Calliope, embracing its mobility and power. In the 1,960 seconds, NATO developed systems based on the M8, an echo of its impact in 1944. One NATO general writes, "The M8 taught us to dominate the battlefield with fire." This audiobook pays tribute to that influence, a reminder of how a weapon born in the urgency of war shaped the future of conflict. But this story isn't just about technology, it's about humanity. German soldiers, facing the fire from heaven in their trenches, showed courage in the face of an unknown terror. Allied artillerymen, factory workers, and French civilians who cheered the thunder as a symbol of liberation, embodied hope. Soldiers' letters, engineers' diaries, and prisoners' accounts reveal the human cost of war, from panic in the trenches to pride on the assembly lines. This audiobook unites their voices, showing that even in chaos, innovation and sacrifice can forge a path to peace. As we close this tale, we pay tribute to all those who fought on the Western Front, the Germans, whose resistance broke under rocket fire, and the Allies, whose technological audacity ensured victory. The M8S, with their roar and trails of fire, didn't just destroy defenses, they changed modern warfare, proving that human ingenuity can overcome even the strongest armies. May these stories, preserved in the echo of thunder, inspire future generations to innovate and persevere. Subscribe, ring the bell, and share this epic journey through the power of the M8 rockets, a chapter of fire and steel that will forever resonate in history.